It's important getting my books, which include a biography of Rogerson. I think you did one of Abe Saffron, didn't you?
My very first book was Abe.
Indeed. So obviously a lot of expertise there. And he's even followed badness into other areas, such as, I think his last book was on the Ruby Princess, where you remember that ship came into Sydney and a large number of people with COVID were allowed out, which is probably a bad thing, even if I don't know if anyone's ever actually been charged with anything.
Interestingly enough, the investigation that was vaunted as being a homicide investigation, no one's heard a peep.
Okay. Anyway, all right, let's get to King's Cross. Anyway, both Louis and Duncan are locals, and I lived in the area for 15 years myself, and I've written a few books about the Sydney underworld, in which King's Cross, by necessity, popped up once or twice. Louis, let's just get going. And can you just start with the geography of the place? Because I think that's kind of important, isn't it? And we often don't see that when we're on our buses and trains.
The thing to understand about King's Cross is that it was built on a cliff top. You don't get that gradient anymore coming up William Street, but William Street used to be a severe gradient. It was an Aboriginal track that went over to the eastern suburbs. And it wasn't built upon. It was very scrubby, and occasionally bushfires would outbreak because it was just so scrubby. Aborigines didn't really live on this cliff top because, as people know who live in King's Cross, during the late afternoon, the cold winds make it very difficult unless you're inside. What actually happened in the 1820s, Governor Darling decided that it would be built upon, and the most wealthiest people in Sydney were asked to provide mansions, and they had to have a certain amount of money. And so there were several mansions built, one like Elizabeth Bay House was built, and they were dotted around the whole area. And so it was called Woolloomooloo Hill, and it was called the Toffs and Snobs who live at Woolloomooloo Hill. Of course, it was a time of convicts. What you used to do in the mansions, you used to have little bells on your windows for the break-ins. And that was the only way to really find it out, because the staff were convicts too. And there was a lot of thieving going on, and people always talked about their staff thieving things and getting drunk. But really, crime didn't happen in the 19th century as we now view King's Cross. What actually happened is in the 1880s, 1890s in Victoria Street, which was a wonderful boulevard and still is, there were two upmarket brothels, and gentlemen used to go there. Those who weren't gentlemen went down to the brothels down in Woolloomooloo. Woolloomooloo, even though it's next door to King's Cross, was a totally different area. It was sort of down market housing, and there were many, many brothels, generally underage girls. One of the things that governments do is bring in laws that for criminals, they think, oh, this is a great law. And what actually happened in 1916 was that it was decided that there would be hotels closing at 6 p.m. rather than 11 p.m. So the sly grog trade started, and this was during the First World War. And for criminals, this was fantastic. A lot of people wanted to buy grog after 6 p.m. And then after the war finished, what actually began to happen was also a trade in cocaine and heroin, because when the ships came in from Asia, the sailors would bring in cocaine and heroin.
We might just pause there if that's okay. Sorry, we're covering a lot of territory very quickly, but just before we get into the drug side of it, Duncan, I mean, it probably is significant, isn't it, that, like Louis says, it was next to a large slum area, basically, but also next to a port.
And the port was incredible. I suppose the port drove crime in Australia, in my humble view. And as I was just saying, you know, ships come in, they've got contraband. The waterfront has always been one of the sort of racier parts for criminals. Pretty much hands off too back in those days, up until even recently. the waterfront workers got away with blue murder. And in communities like Balmain, Pyrmont, and Woolloomooloo, where the major commercial wharves were, a lot of thieving, drugs coming in, and then the criminal networks then split out from it. Interesting enough, it's an old criminal expression, so pardon me, you don't shit in your own nest. So while the locals lived and worked in those areas.
Sorry, you can't. Sorry, do you mind holding it a bit closer?
Yeah. Are you switch? Yep.
Some of our audience having a bit of trouble here.
A little more volume, maybe. Curious enough, the people who lived in Balmain, Pyrmont, and Woolloomooloo. Good. That's they didn't commit criminal acts in that area. They stole, and it became the sort of distribution point, I suppose, the warehousing network. And then they'd pump their stuff out. And, and cocaine, of course, is a favorite subject of mine. And I'll get it just before I forget. Back in the 1930s, when cocaine was at its zenith in Australia, we had the world's biggest per capita usage. I think we were about 40% more per capita than number 2, who was the USA. And that sort of has the waterfront, access to the waterfront has driven crime in the areas nearby. King's Cross became, as we'll chat about later, pretty much the epicenter of crime in Australia. And it's in part because of the waterfront communities being adjacent to it.
Yeah, and we'll talk a lot more about that in a moment. Louis, what happened to the Aboriginal inhabitants? I've just been reading a book about Sydney and Aboriginal people, and I know there was a lot of violence on the frontier, which back then was kind of like the river, the Hawkesbury River, the Appin massacre of 1816. But around here, I mean, one of the issues was smallpox, wasn't it? The Aboriginal people, to some extent, they weren't as many of them as the Captain Phillip had thought there might be.
Well, one of the things about the Gadigal people, which are around this area, the smallpox so affected them that after 3 or 4 years, there was only 3 Gadigal people left. And one has to think that what actually happened is that Aborigines came in from Broken Bay, Botany, and the North Shore, because they came. What actually happened is Aborigines stayed away from the settlement for a couple of years. They were unsure about everything, as they naturally would be. And then they started to come in. They liked the tea, they liked the alcohol and the bread. And so that they came in and they liked mixing. And Governor Phillip allowed this to actually happen. The whole caricature of Aborigines being drunk and everything happened after Phillip left, after 4 years, when more settlers came in, more convicts came in, and they treated the Aborigines very, very badly. In this particular area, King's Cross, now, as I said, up high, it was too cold, really. What actually happened was the Aborigines settled, there was a lot of ceremonial places in Woolloomooloo. And right up until the 1820s, 1830s, Aborigines used to come in from, as I say, the south and north, and they used to have battles, which whites would go to and everything, because there's hardly any other entertainments, and they would fight. And so this was great entertainment. There were Russian and English and French sailors and artists who, when they were in Sydney in the 1820s, 1830s, could not believe that these fights were for the entertainment of the whites especially, and they berated the British, going, how dare you have these cruel demonstrations of fighting. But the Aborigines liked it. They used to get the Aborigines drunk. And the thing that really appalled the foreign visitors was the white teenage girls who went there to watch the fights, even though the Aboriginal men were naked. And they were appalled at this coarseness of the white teenage girls. And one of the things that we did, it was the 1830s, 1840s, what actually happened, the missionaries came in. And so a lot of the locals were shifted down to La Perouse, which is where the La Perouse Aboriginal community developed. Others were sent to near the Mildura area, and they were scattered because it was easier for the whites at the time.
Okay, and getting back to crime, or crimes of a different sort, you were telling us about the big estates along the ridge that I think Governor Darling set up. Can you tell us, and then you'd move forward a bit to the 20th century, how did that develop into what I think was Australia's first high-rise area? I just want to establish the physical geography before we plunge back into the details of crime.
Well, what actually happened, first of all, there was the depressions of the 1840s and 1890s, especially 1890s, when the mansions were subdivided. And then you had terraces being built, you had new roads in King's Cross being built. And then what actually happened after the First World War, more and more mansions were divided up into flats. And there was a movement you see, what actually happened is Sydney, unlike Melbourne, fell in love with American modernism. And so they started to build these apartment blocks, which is in Springfield Avenue in the 20s and 30s and in Macleay Street, based on American models. Because one of the important things about King's Cross, it was only a 15-minute walk into the city. And so for city workers, it was fantastic. So what you had by the 1920s, King's Cross had the highest density of population in the whole of Australia. And the important thing is a lot of were single women and single men. And that really created interesting problems, including, this is a technical thing, but it really is important with these flats, their kitchens were very, very small. So a lot of people ate out all the time. So you had the development of restaurants, sly grog places, and everything else like that. It was just because the kitchens were so small.
Yeah, that brings back some memories. Tiny kitchens. So Duncan, you were talking a little bit before then about the cocaine trade, and we were talking about Woolloomooloo. Obviously later in the century, the 20th century, King's Cross became the sort of crime epicenter, but say in the 30s and 40s, before World War II anyway, was it associated with crime so specifically, or was the crime spread around more in other areas like Woolloomooloo, Surrey Hills?
Yeah, I think back in the 20s and 30s, it wasn't a crime capital at all. I was just reading, my mother grew up there, my grandfather used to live there when we were kids. They just remember it as being a wonderful place full of single people, artists, actors, theatricals, people just making a quid. But the notion of criminality was pretty minor. That's what happened in Woolloomooloo, and of course in some parts of Paddington, and in some, of course, lots of parts of Darlinghurst. It occasionally overflowed there, and I think, I can't remember the exact date, but there was the Battle of Kellett Street, which is rather luridly described. Kellett Street, for non-locals, is a sort of lovely little, beautiful little dogleg behind Darlinghurst Road. These days full of elegant terraces, which have remained, thank goodness. Most of them are restaurants, a couple of brothels. And it used to be, there was also a couple of other establishments which were possibly somewhat more raffish, a couple of casinos. But back in there's the Battle of Kellett Street, where allegedly there were three major criminals running around the area at the time. There was Kate Lee and Tilly Devine, and a guy called Phil, unfortunately, the Jew Jeffs. And they were all sort of dabbling in crime. They were running variously casinos, brothels, cocaine distribution, which was massive and driving the underworld at that stage, and sly grog, of course. And they eventually, various players in these organizations had a battle one night in Kellett Street, ended up in Kellett Street. It started as a skirmish and then ran. This is a razor gang time. And it ran up to Kellett Street. And I think the Truth newspaper, always wonderful to read, which is available on Trove, talks about Kellett Street running with blood that night of the men who were sliced with razors. And Kellett Street in those days was also an unsealed road, apparently. So just picture, if you will, about 20 or 30 men involved in a melee, flashing razor blades in the glimmering light, and blood sweeping down this street, possibly a bit overwritten. But this is a place, it was just a skirmish. But King's Cross, certainly in those days, I think was far more genteel. And we had the first waves too coming in the early to mid 30s of people leaving Europe in a hurry because they realized things were about to go to hell over there. And it was one of those warm, embracing place. And I think it's where the life square pegs would naturally gravitate because they didn't fit anywhere else. And that's one of the joys about the Cross, is it was always this extraordinarily welcoming and not terribly judgmental place. I mean, there might be a couple of raised eyebrows, but my great uncle lived up there for years, and he had a knighthood and all this sort of shit. And he was a distinguished serviceman in the Air Force. And you go to visit him and his wife, who was a bit like Hyacinth Bouquet, but he was a lovely old fella, and Greenknow Avenue, and they had a couple of drag queens down at the end of the hallway in their building, and they had sex workers upstairs. He said, we live in the Cross, so what? It was just dear Auntie Hyacinth was sort of clutching her pearls and horrified by them. So I think, oh, Jackie said, whatever it is what it is. You just roll with it.
You agree with that, Louis, to some extent. The Cross is where a lot of things happen that didn't happen anywhere else in Sydney, or were allowed to happen.
I think Duncan's right, except the King's Cross did have a reputation, a racy reputation. Judith Wright, the poet, lived in King's Cross in the 1930s, and her parents were so appalled that she could live in King's Cross because it was single women. Obviously, orgies were happening. And so she used to say she lived in Elizabeth Bay, which is just 100 meters down the road. And it made all the difference to Judith Wright's parents because it was singles were living together in flats. And one of the things that women loved was to get out of suburbia so they didn't have this moralistic people around them telling them that they should marry, that they should do this. And so it really created to the rest of Sydney this whole idea that there was just, it was highly sexual, there was homosexuals, but also, as Duncan was saying, it was such a welcoming place. So much so there used to be a lot of drag parties, and in those days, police would arrest you if you had drag parties, but if a woman was holding a drag party, a real woman, you couldn't be arrested. And so they made sure that they got the local woman to be there looking after, 12 Shirley Temples and Carmen Mirandas dressed up and everything else like that. And there's a wonderful book, At the Cross, written by a gay guy, John Rose. It talks about a very famous incident where there was a whole lot of drag queens at this party. And even though it was run by a real woman, the police raided it. And then the police escorted the whole of the drag queens. You got to remember, about 50 to 60, all dressed up as Carmen Miranda and everything, to Darlinghurst police station. The locals leaned out of the windows and said, "How dare you," to the cops, "how dare you do this? This is King's Cross. We're tolerant. Don't arrest them. Don't do anything to them. We allow this to happen." And that was the attitude of the Cross.
Yeah, you raised an interesting point before. I used to live in 4 different places around there, each of them within a 5-minute stumble of the El Alamein fountain. And not once was I in King's Cross. There is actually a tight bunch of suburbs, aren't there? Rushcutters Bay, Elizabeth, Potts Point, very tight.
Yes, and this is the fascinating thing. It's like a dingo fence is erected between King's Cross and Elizabeth Bay. Now, of course, there's no King's Cross because real estate agents hate the name. So it's now Potts Point South. And you just go, yeah, sure, Potts Point South. So you have it different, but actually King's Cross didn't exist. It was never actually a real place. It was more a state of mind. It was how you referred to the cross, but it wasn't a real suburb like Darlinghurst or Potts Point. And so this is a thing a lot of people don't understand. It really didn't exist as an actual physical, as an actual place.
So Duncan, let's get into some crime now. Post-war, when do you reckon things really started to change? We had this cosmopolitan place where your relatives lived and that was all okay. When did it start to get, if you like, seriously criminal, seedy?
Well, the crime really kicked off during World War II, again, because of the proximity to the ports. The black market in World War II was extraordinary, as you would not expect, because we had, rationing and all that sort of stuff. Things like stockings, condoms, and car tires were very hard to get hold of. So all of a sudden, there's this huge business in rubber goods. Simultaneously, because the Japanese had sort of stuffed up Malaysia, so things were getting a bit problematic. Likewise, booze, you know, as Louis mentioned earlier, we had the 6 o'clock closing. So creative landlords are working out a number of ways to get around this, which were very successful. We had this glorious thing, which I just love it. If you ordered your booze online, if you ordered your booze by phone, it would be delivered to you at the restaurant after 6 o'clock. So they just beat the living hell out of this. And you had people, there's the rise of Abe Saffron as well, bought his first pub in William Street in 1940 something or other. Bottom line is, yeah, you couldn't sell booze after 6 o'clock, but everyone just turned a blind eye to that, and everyone was as drunk as a skunk in the back room. That's how the cross worked. And that's when the criminals started taking an interest in it, because there was money to be made, organizing it, offering them protection. And it sort of, that was the genesis. And also back in those days, drugs, not cocaine so much, because that had been stamped out pretty much by World War II. Prescription drugs became fashionable as well. Things you could just get from your dodgy local chemist, or in case of cocaine and other things, your dodgy local dentist. Great business in dentistry, by the way, because they could prescribe really much unfettered. So it was kicking along. The great scandal in the cross happened in 1951, 52, I think it was, when they had a royal commission into the supply of grog after hours. So it was the first time I think we really started focusing on where we could have a good time. And, oh, this is a bit naughty. We all became a little bit sort of pearl clutching back then. The ladies' temperance society were giving everyone nut, just going off their nut about it all. So we had this royal commission, and curiously, and I spoke to Saffron about this because he appeared, lied through his teeth, got caught out. And I remember he said to me, I'm giving evidence. I'm having my reputation trashed because I'm running establishments where you can booze after dark. And I'm looking at the bar table and at the judge, and he said, they've all been clients of mine. So they'd go into the roving room, the wig and gown would come on in serious faces. They'd go in, kick the living crap out of the publicans who were making $1, and then that night they would possibly be at the same place. So that was when it got its start, and people started gravitating towards the cross because the nightlife picked up as well. But I suppose the major turning point for the cross to make it into fairly disastrous crime epicenter was the arrival of the American servicemen in 1967 on R&R, come down for 6 or 7 days or something or other, pocket full of money. I was doing some research, and I think it's pretty spot on what I was reading. In today's money, they estimated that there was $70 million going through the King's Cross, I think, in a week. I may have that slightly back. I think it was about 70 million a week being driven. That's in today's money, not back then. Driven through the King's Cross, when nightclubs, restaurants, booze, just by servicemen wanting to get a break away. And if you ever, just for a bit of fun, devil in YouTube, if you put in the cross R&R, you'll get this wonderful video that they used to produce for the American, shows the American servicemen arriving. They arrive on a bus from Mascot. They're taken straight away to the Chevron Hilton Hotel, which is now the Icon building in Macleay Street. A very personable young chap then gives them a sort of do's and don'ts of Sydney. One of the do's is, if you have any drugs on you, give them to me. I might use them later. It's right out there. And then the director, obviously not with much of a budget, says, and here we are, we're out in the suburbs now with these lovely families of inviting the young fellas home for a roast. Well, it's down in St. Neots Avenue. You can actually see the bloody bridge through it. So they haven't gone terribly far. And it's just very funny. But that's when the cross kicked in, because heroin changed crime in Australia. Back in the good old days when we were having a bit of fun, crime was, apart from the protection rackets and booze, crime was doing safe jobs, doing armed robberies, good old-fashioned heist and that sort of stuff. And while that continued, heroin just suddenly from about 67 when it started, and the addiction, Australia's addiction, started through the young blokes coming in with the stuff in their back pocket, and the sex workers and other people they were dealing with. And that's how heroin spread rapidly.
We might just pause at that point. Louis, what your view of the post-war period up until the 70s? Is it similar to what Duncan said?
Oh, very similar. My mother left Melbourne when she was 16 during the Second World War because of the Americans, and she came up to the cross, and she found herself caught up in the black market. She was 16, and also she just loved the whole idea that she could seduce lieutenants and captains because the officers were in the cross. The black servicemen were in Woolloomooloo, and just down south in Surrey Hills, so it was segregated. And so there's a lot of money, there's a lot of prostitution. Then it was one of the things that Abe Saffron did cotton on to. He owned the Gladstone Hotel down in William Street, is that he also owned the Roosevelt, and that's where American officers and everything went. So he could secretly move the booze from the Gladstone Hotel to the Roosevelt, charge an outrageous fee. And that's how he started to make his money at the Roosevelt Club. The Roosevelt Club is still in existence. And also the nightlife, the Minerva Theatre was one of the most prestigious theatres in Sydney. And so what you used to do, you used to go to the theatre, and the only places where you could go after the theatre was still in the Cross, where they'd serve illegal booze. Also, you've got to remember there was gambling. There was a lot of gambling in the 20s and 30s. There was in small rooms. It was, and also SP Bookie, because everybody thought, oh, you put money on this illegal thing, SP Bookie, and everybody used to do it. The poet Kenneth Slessor used to do it. And so it used to move into small games of cards and everything. And then it expanded, especially in the 1950s, when it started to be rather posh and suave little casinos through the Cross and down Double Bay. And so it was, one of the things is people go, oh, the Cross heroin. It was so hard to get before the Americans came in with R&R. Lennie Bruce, when he came to Australia in 1961, was a heroin addict. And in the Cross, he tried to get heroin. The only place that he could get it from was there was a doctor in Orwell Street who said, Lennie, I think I've got it for you. And so that it was so rare, and the only other place you could get it was in Chinatown. So it was very, very rare. And when the Americans came in, as Duncan was saying, they did spend so much money, but they brought their habit with them. And so it had to be fulfilled. And there was the other big thing that was actually happening. They loved marijuana. And then it started to be the cultivation of marijuana plantations in Queensland that fed into King's Cross. It was a huge market. And there's also prostitution, and that was huge. And there was also, as my mother used to say in the Second World War, there were charity moles, women who would give away sex for free, and they weren't very well liked at all.
The grasshoppers, thanks. Duncan, so from 1972, roughly 2000, was that the Cross's really bad period, driven partly by heroin?
Yeah, I think heroin, well, it became a magnet for heroin users, which also brought increases in prostitution, all that sort of stuff, and the ghastly people that ran the trade. But at the upper level, the upper echelon of crime, it also became the place where Sydney organised crime would go to gather. And it's where the coppers, as you know, and I remember very clearly back in 1980 when I first arrived there, it was a place where the coppers would go, and you'd have this weird thing. It was almost, you'd have the crims in the bourbon and beefsteak, for example, plotting all sorts of nefarious things, networking, and you'd have the cops at the same club saying, hello, how are you? Oh, nice to see you. What are you up to tonight? And I suppose I could not mention this. My favourite nightclub in the Cross at the time, where cops and crims gathered in equal measure, and sailors and prostitutes and so on and so forth, was the Venus Room. The most remarkable. It's like yes, what it's 32 Orwell Street for anyone who cares to visit. It's now a very boring backpackers. Extraordinary place. Abe opened it in the early 60s from memory as what he was hoping to be a very upmarket restaurant serving cocktails and chicken in a basket, which you can't go past. And he soon found that it wasn't really doing it all well because no one was particularly interested. They wanted something a little bit more interesting. So Abe, being astute to the market, took it down market fast. And in the late 60s, I think it was, installed his new mate who appealed to him enormously, a bloke called James McCartney Anderson, who is spectacular. And so Jimmy's running it. And the place goes downhill so fast, it's not funny. I turned up there, and I think in 1980 as a kid, wandered in, we were on the night shift in the Cross, I wandered in with my workmate. We're looking around, and it's coppers in one corner from the armed hold-up squad, the special breaking squad, the consorting squad, a couple of really serious bad crims, blokes out on day leave from Long Bay because you could get away with it in those days. There's a tranny on the bar stripping, and it's good evening, gentlemen. You intend to dine with us, don't you? I thought, oh yeah, absolutely. There's a sausage roll in the warmer just sort of sitting there for anyone dumb enough to actually do it. And the place is just rocking. Upstairs is a brothel. Just extraordinary. But it was later declared as being a disorderly house some 20 years after it's sort of reached zenith, I note. And this is a very King's Cross incident at the time. Jimmy Anderson's running the joint one night, and a standover man and sort of pretty mid-ranking crook called Donnie the Glove Smith. Donnie turns up with his girlfriend, whose daughter is stripping at the club as well. There's a bit of it's a bit murky anyway. There's a fracas in the men's toilet, and Jimmy and Donnie have a bit of a dust up, and there's a shot or two fired. Donnie then departs with a bit of a huff out to the waiting car. Jimmy Anderson then shoots him 2 or 3 times in the back. Donnie falls dead on the street. Jimmy claims self-defense. He's arrested, and then the charge just disappears, and he's never prosecuted for it. Very King's Cross in the day.
And it was extraordinary. And a lot of it was down to prohibition, basically. There were laws that didn't allow people to get the entertainment they wanted. And Abe Saffron would be the first to argue this. And therefore, people just provided it anyway. I knew a man in the 1980s who tried to buy a block of flats there, and it had a place down the bottom called the Mansell Room, which was a sort of bar nightclub which stayed open at all hours. And I used to go there. I used to play in bands, and it was the only place open in Sydney, at 5 in the morning often, if you wanted to drink and so on. And the real estate agent assured my friend that you could charge an enormous amount of rent to the people who leased the Mansell Room, because they were paying the cops $3,000 a week to stay open beyond the normal hours. And it just went on. It went on for years. It was an amazing arrangement. Louis, before we move towards gentrification, anything about those 2 or 3 decades of horror and pleasure that you'd like to mention?
The first thing is to mention Phil the Jew. He ran the 50-50 club, the corner of William and Forbes Street in the 40s. He taught Abe Saffron something. It used to be easy to pay off the cops. Phil the Jew, Jeff, decided that he'd pay off the politicians too. And Abe Saffron learnt that. And one of the things about the sinister nature of Abe Saffron is he did corrupt New South Wales politics. He paid off 2 police commissioners. He used to actually dine with the police commissioners, of course, at the Bourbon. And so everything was on public display. And that's where Abe Saffron was rather good. Abe Saffron's hero was Budsy Siegel. He used to have a picture of him on his wall. And he didn't do damage himself, but he had a group around him to do damage. The other thing that did happen is that Abe and Jimmy Anderson like to set fire to stuff and get the insurance. One of Jimmy's first forays for Abe Saffron was to set fire to the Stiletto Club. And so he poured all the petrol in and blew himself up. He ended up in hospital for 5 months. And he kept on insisting that, look, Your Honor, I went in there because I suspected somebody else was setting, fire to the Stiletto, and I just blew up in my face. And so he used to send other people to light the fires, and so did Abe Saffron. So there was a whole lot of things were happening, which was arson. There's political corruption. And I remember I had just come up from Melbourne to live in Sydney, and I went to the Venus Room, and I thought, boy, you don't get that in Melbourne.
No.
And watching the girls with what they were doing to themselves and everything on the stage, and there were cops and everything else like that. And I thought, wow, this is a different place, isn't it?
I did find it enlightening, actually, and I was so enlightened by it, I went back quite regularly.
Yeah. I have a friend, a former detective in the police force, and he worked in Tweed Heads, and then he came to Sydney, and Rogerson said, I'll show you the bourbon. And Jason said they used to have drinking sessions that went on for 12 hours. And
Short day.
yeah, short day. And there was all the cops around it. And he said he was a great seducer of bringing the other cops into, look, it really doesn't matter. Look at that guy over there. Look at that guy there. And so he was a great seducer of other people, except for his brother, I think. Who...
Yeah, his brother isn't fond of him. A career killer. Your name is Rogerson. You've got some problems. And his brother was a licensing cop. So everyone goes, But his brother was as straight as a die, Owen, and a lovely bloke whose life was pretty much screwed over by his elder brother.
Duncan, yeah, tell us about the police. What was the police role in this situation we've just been describing for 30 years? Was every policeman present company accepted in King's Cross involved in this in some way?
There was sort of three groups. There was the bolshy ones who thought this was appalling and shouldn't happen, which is a few of myself and a few mates were in. There were the people who were there who just thought, yeah, it's happening, but I don't want to know about it. And, you know, they're often criticized, but these are people with wife, kids, mortgages, blah, blah, blah. It's a career killer in the New South Wales police forces. A few of us found out to disagree with the status quo. And then there was a hardcore crooks, of which there were quite a number, and you know, from taking $100 to taking 10,000. And in Rogerson's case, you don't get much worse than that. He'd literally pull the fillings from your teeth. He took a large amount of money. He arranged murders and armed robberies. And at one point, he sort of made sure that Sally Ann Huckstep died, famous cross identity herself. Her mate, Lynn Woodward, died, probably with Rogers' support. Chris Flannery, the hitman who was running around the cross killing anyone for $1, he departed thanks to Roger. That's while Roger was still a copper, so he was fairly busy. And then he was, of course, involved in the Blue Murder stuff, which you've seen, which is reasonably accurate, at least the first episode is, where he's organising crimes with Nettie Smith, who is his drinking partner, again, round the cross. On occasions, you would wonder, and you'd see Roger and Nettie. Lunch started at midday, and they'd still be kicking on at midnight. And you knew to avoid both of them because Roger could be charming when he wanted to be, but diabolical when he didn't. And I saw him change once, and you just watch this. Literally, you see the shadow go across those sparkling blue eyes. And think, time to be somewhere else. And Nettie was just insane. And Nettie also had a sidekick who's, I think, appearing here, Graham Henry, who was somewhat reasonably well known apart from being Nettie's sidekick. And this is a brutal joke, so please excuse me. We were having lunch some years ago, crooks, cops, writers, and all that sort of stuff. We're all around the table telling war stories, as one does. And Graham Henry turned up and sat down beside a mate of mine. And my mate, who's an old detective who was absolutely straight as a die and worked the Crossfields, grew up there actually, where the Blay Girls is, when it was his grandmother's boarding house. He just grabs a steak knife, puts it in front of Graham Henry and says, mate, do you want to get it over and done with now? Because Graham's last major crime was getting upset with the police prosecutor and whipping out a steak knife and stabbing him in the neck. Didn't kill him, fortunately. Graham found this reasonably amusing. The table cracked up.
Moving ahead just a little, John Ibrahim wrote his memoirs, Last King of the Cross. And in that book, he argued that his business model was that in the 90s, the cross was so anarchic with the police not doing their job properly, that it was a pretty violent place. And one of the reasons he was able to succeed in multiple nightclubs was because he basically had a private security army, members of his family and others, and he was able to guarantee safety if you actually went to one of his nightclubs. Is there some truth in that?
It's not an unreasonable call, probably a bit of a license in there. And I suppose something I didn't mention before when we're chatting. One of the things I always found about the cross is it sort of looked after itself in a strange way. There were back in the days, there were lots of coppers everywhere back in the 80s. There were also lots of people indoors and all that sort of stuff. And if you were making a real fool out of yourself or you were dangerous, chances are someone would grab a hold of you and throw you in the back of a cab, preferably opening the door first, which wasn't always the case, and get you out of the joint. It was a community that sort of existed. And if someone was getting really unruly, they'd be looked after or told to go somewhere else. In the 90s, I think the cops, and there's a couple of reasons for it. The short detail is that King's Cross Police had a really bad incident in 1989 when Internal Affairs raided them and started arresting cops because they were running a drug ring using a couple of pedophiles and a few other people to make it, and a young bloke from Parramatta they were standing over to distribute it. And the cross went into that really dark period. It was, a lot of the coppers were terrible crooks. They took their hand off the streets. And I think that was, it's been an annoyance of mine for a number of years, is that they ceased to be active on the streets. They ceased to be highly visible. They ceased to stop talking to people and asking what's going on. And I think that's in part why the anarchy that John Ibrahim describes is reasonably accurate. The place was coming a little unglued, and Ibrahim took that as an opportunity to make sure that, you know, kids coming in from the suburbs, because by that stage we had a train station, that they could actually get around the cross and get out of the cross without a huge amount of risk. That was John's a very astute operator.
For sure. Louis, we'll just talk for another 5 minutes or so, then I'll ask you for questions in the audience. Louis, gentrification, when did that start and why? What happened to the crime?
Well, I think in the 90s, things became very bad in the cross. I remember, you know, you just come across people who'd overdosed in the street. Thank God for the injection center, let me tell you. It was open. The drug taking and the selling was so open in the cross. There was underage prostitution. There was pedophiles. It was really totally out of control. And for a writer like myself, quite wonderful. Except at one time I went to my apartment in Callett Street, found a thief robbing me, and I fought with him. I locked him in my bedroom because I was on the second floor, and I ran to the police station and I said to the cop there, I said, look, I've got this thief. And the cop went, yeah, we know who it is. And I went, good. Could you go and get it? Mate, we don't have the time. We don't have the time. And, you know, he yawned, and I thought, oh, that was the King's Cross police in the 90s. And so I went back there, and the thief had actually thrown himself through the window, crashed through the window, landed in the courtyard, and there was blood everywhere, but it escaped. So he didn't go to the cops for any help at all. What actually happened was in the 1960s to the 70s, there was completely undisciplined development. Askin started it. And so you had developers just building these cheap apartments in the suburbs. And you also had the whole fact of developers deciding all these old terraces in Victoria Street and everything could be torn down and these huge towers built. Woolloomooloo is going to go the same way. And so there's the famous incident in Victoria Street where there were students, unionists and everything fighting Thiemann, who was going to build all these skyscraper apartment blocks. Abe Saffron was part of it. Jimmy Anderson was part of it. And then there was the killing of Juanita Nilsson, who was part of the Mark Foy family, heiress. And she went to where Les Girls was, the carousel, and she disappeared. There are many theories about that, all involving Jimmy Anderson and a transvestite from New Zealand. So it was a very King's Cross story. And so she disappeared, obviously killed and murdered. And then there was torture. And then there was a compromise reached. So a couple of towers were built really ugly. You could see how the cross would have looked. But really, the government just gave developers fait accompli. You could do whatever you liked. And I think the other thing that changed was the railway station. That changed part of the cross. And, you know, then people began to think, oh, no, what we'll actually do is we'll save a lot of the cross. The other thing that actually happened was, you see, the cross used to be a tourist mecca. There were 12 basic huge hotels where people used to stay. And so they were converted into apartments. So it became posh, especially Potts Point and now Potts Point South. And also it's a huge gay community. So the gays could afford these huge prices. In Darlinghurst and King's Cross, 20% of the people are gay. And that meant that they had huge incomes, and that resulted in restaurants. Then, of course, the city of Sydney decided in the early 21st century that it'd be 24-hour free-for-all in the cross, and that got completely out of hand. And there were king hits, people dying, and then it was restricted, and it still is restricted, the hours and what drink you can actually serve. King's Cross has always been the id of Australia. It's where it's an island unto itself. It's where the first changes, modernism or art or anything, actually changed in the cross. And just one final thing about Abe Saffron. The reason why Abe Saffron was rather good for the whole entertainment industry, my wife's father used to be a drummer in bands. Abe Saffron paid all the musicians in cash straight away. He built up, he had investments in about 10 nightclubs, which were, some of them were really good. They brought out Frank Sinatra and everything else like that. So in a curious way, despite him being a criminal, he also promoted King's Cross as an entertainment district of high value. And there you have that Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde thing, which is part of the cross.
Yeah, I might ask you a similar question. I realized things were changing. I was editing a newspaper or magazine in Sydney in I think it was 96. And we realized that we were hearing a lot more about this place called Cabramatta. So I sent a journalist out there, and he was a fairly disreputable looking journalist. And he came back and said he'd been offered heroin 11 times before he left the station precinct. So at that point, we started to wonder if maybe a center of gravity of a certain sort was moving west. Is that part of the change, Duncan?
Yeah, decentralisation has always been a New South Wales government hallmark. Yeah, and the cross became too obvious. And sort of back at the late 80s, early 90s, it was being, Abe had gone, Jimmy Anderson was just about to keel over. John Ibrahim was running his own show, and you had these rabbits running around the cross, crazy people like the Bayer brothers, who are still kicking around, and they have been convicted of many things, so I can get away with that. The place was just a free-for-all. You had all these wannabe gangsters coming into the cross thinking this is where it's all going to happen for me. But it wasn't happening for them. They're all getting arrested. A guy called Danny Karam actually was murdered by his own team of crooks. And then the Bayer brothers all got arrested. Things were turning to hell. The New South Wales Police Royal Commission came along, which turned the focus on the cross and the coppers at the cross. The leading informant in the Royal Commission was a guy called Trevor Haken, who in his glory days was in fact a detective at King's Cross with his mate Chook Fowler. Anyone who remembers back long ago, they had Chook Cam, which is they'd loaded their car up with a camera, and you've got this rather unpleasant look of Chook Fowler looking up his trouser leg while he and Trevor Haken are doing a deal. And this is the boss and the second most senior detective at the cross at the time. But Sydney's demands were changing too, spreading fast. So Cabramatta was a logical place. It had the criminal infrastructure, thanks to the Southeast Asian crime gangs that were calling it home. It became a draw card, and the cross was at the same time gentrifying. So if you're an addict at the cross, you're becoming more conspicuous because the demographic was changing. Just to echo what Louis said, I remember back in the early 90s, the first thing you do in the morning when you went out to drive somewhere is walk around the car to make sure some poor bastard wasn't underneath it or beside it. And, every couple of times a month or something or other, that's a slight exaggeration, you'd be ringing AAA saying there's some poor bastard eat outside. You sort of put them in the right spot till the ambos arrived. It was becoming undesirable to be a crook in the cross. And other criminal players, Southwest Sydney was opening up as this wonderful criminal wonderland that we have today.
Okay, thanks very much, both of you. I think we might open up for questions now, if anyone's got any. We've only touched on the subject lightly. I'm fully aware of that. Please. There's Louis.
Could you repeat the question for the people at the back, please?
Yeah, sorry about that. The question is, are there any colourful characters in the cross these days?
Look, if they are, they're probably in a wheelchair or a Zimmer frame. Or in the Gold Coast. A lot of them retired to the Gold Coast. A lot of the performers of Les Girls retired to the Gold Coast too, like Carlotta and everything. And they knew this underworld very, very well. And also one has to remember the prostitution left the cross. It went to Canterbury Road and it went into the suburbs, the massage parlors and everything. And also the internet changed the whole thing about sex. And so once prostitution left, of course, the pimps left. I remember I had an office in Minton Place, which was on the corner of Bayswater Road and Darlinghurst Road. And I looked out the window and there was a prostitute who was out of it, completely out of it, walked across the road, hit lightly by a car, landed on Darlinghurst Road, and the pimp ran out of the hotel and went, you've taken her, meaning she won't be working today. I won't get the money. And that was in the 90s. It was pretty wild then. But no, I think the whole demographic has changed now. People, on Potts Point website, apparently are trying to find the best cheese, the best hairdresser, the best nail place. Very different from the 90s.
Thanks for that. If anyone watching, by the way, wants to send in some questions, now's a good time to do it. Please, another question here. Okay, so did a man named Stuart John Regan have a lot to do with the cross? Duncan?
No. Short answer is no. He was a suburban boy. He came to the cross occasionally. He was a criminal who was somewhat overrated above his abilities. He was shot to death, God, somewhere years ago, in a pub out around Marrickville from memory. So the answer, no, he was a ne'er-do-well. He was a bloke who hung around the more serious crims like Lennie McPherson, Stan Smith and so on. Not highly respected, dangerous bastard though, because he was one of those crims who just thought, he'd shoot you the same way you'd consider the waiter's offer. Do you want your steak medium rare, sir? He's not dissimilar to Rogerson in some respects, though nowhere near as smart. Just a violent, very, very dangerous man, but whose partner loved him desperately. And she was a hotel owner down in Palmer Street for a while, before the tradesman, when it was still the Tradesman's Arms, and then it gentrified and became the East Village Hotel, which is nowhere near as much fun as it used to be.
So the question is, have the police lifted their game a bit in the years since the 1990s?
I think the best thing in policing in the cross would be if they pull that bloody police station down. It is the ugliest building I've seen in years. It's a nightmare of a place. Bottom line is they don't have much to police anymore. They're reasonably active. You see them walking around occasionally. They don't have a lot to do. It's so damn genteel these days. It's not much fun.
Well, let me tell you, there's more problems in Woolloomooloo, and there is a police station down at Woolloomooloo, which they never inhabit anymore. And I asked one of the cops for it. He said, oh, mate, we'd have to be working 24 hours a day down at Woolloomooloo. And that's why I only find the police guys, sirens going, heading under the bridge and everything else like that. I meet some of the cops, and there was the lead cop at the time was a woman. And she told the story about this poor country boy who came down. He was a country cop. She said, look, you got to listen. We're set up these special microphones and everything so you can overhear the drug deals going down. The trouble was, it was ICE and there were gay guys, and the poor country cop, the sex that was involved that he was hearing all the time, he just went, I want to go back to the country. Honestly, I just want to go back to the country.
This rings a bell. Yeah. Yeah. It's just, there's the underbelly to, underbelly, I use the term broadly rather than specifically. There is drug problems at the cross, they're still there, but it's pretty boring by comparison. As a copper, as a young copper, you'd walk, 40 years ago, you'd walk in there. And you reminded me, actually, I was part of the juvenile crime squad in 1982, which was tasked to clear up the prostitution, predators, pedophiles, blah, 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 that were habitués of the cross. And just as a pure curiosity, this is how history is fascinating. One of the blokes we hated back in 1982, who was running a child refuge, which was anything but, is in court this month, finally being sentenced for his crimes. It's taken them decades to get a hold of him. But these days, it's a bit boring. And the cops don't respond that quickly. And if you go to the Potts Point Facebook page, which some of you may be members on, so I'll be careful. Yeah, there's cheese is a big discussion. Moving box is huge. And skate parks, which causes them to go screaming at each other to the point you have to remind them that in a public site, defamation is potentially an issue. sometimes I unkindly suggest it's like bloody Mossman.
This
With all
is
due respect to Mossman.
the skate park down in Rushcutters Bay, is it? Or proposed?
Oh, the proposed
Yeah.
skate park. You'd think it was Gomorrah.
I used to know a prostitute, and during the Vietnam War, she used to take soldiers down there where they'd be beaten up by two of her friends and robbed of everything. And that was Rushcutters Bay Park
It's
back
a
then.
business.
That's right. Yeah, it's all changed. One more question, if anyone's got one, please. Okay, the question is, did the Wood Royal Commission of the mid-1990s arrange for heroin to be sold so they could follow it through to see who was involved in that? And did that misfire and lead to the death of a large number of addicts? Duncan, any thoughts?
Yeah, I've heard similar rumors, and there are actually a couple of rumors that sort of join up at some point. I've never seen any evidence that that's the case. It's like Sydney is a wonderful place, and the Cross particularly. If you want a rumor, go to the Cross immediately. You'll hear everything. But the reality sometimes is different. I always take the view that where there's smoke, there's just possibly smoke. I want to see a bit of fire. It is quite possible that the police were watching an operation, you bet. This is the days when electronic surveillance had come in, so there is a possibility they were watching it. It would be incredibly foolhardy to let the heroin loose in public domain. I haven't seen any evidence to confirm that was the case. There was an issue around about the same time, which is where some of these things may link up, is that Sydney had a heroin drought for quite some time, and all of a sudden some heroin came back onto the streets at higher price. And the problem with it was that people had been hanging out for some drugs. The new stuff arrives. It's actually better quality because, you know, as anyone who's dealt with drugs knows, that some of the powders you get in your pocket may not necessarily contain much of what you're hoping for. They've been stamped on it by all sorts of horrible things. And when the heroin drought ended with a new supply, there were a lot of people dropping with overdoses simply because, one, they were slightly weaned off, so their resistance was lowered. And secondly, they were actually inadvertently getting high quality stuff, which was what caused deaths. I would be surprised if the cops were stupid enough to let heroin go out on the street and actually into people's arms. But I've heard similar rumors though.
I'm afraid we might, sorry, we might have to wrap it up now. This is a complicated area.
Yeah.
And we just don't have time to go into it in any more detail. Sorry, Louis, did you want to say something finally and quickly?
Yes, that may have happened. I've written a book on King's Cross, one on Woolloomooloo, and my book on Sydney's coming out at the end of the year. Now, one thing I have learned about doing the histories is don't trust oral history. There's people make up stuff and memories play havoc with them. And this is the thing that I have learned writing these 3 books is never trust oral history. That's it.
All right. We'll end on that note, which would have sucked a lot of the fun out of the subject, but luckily we only finished then. Look, thank you very much to Louis Nowra and Duncan McNab for talking to us. Now, their books will be available, and so too will the books of some of our volunteers who it turns out are authors. And we'd like to thank our volunteers, and can you please join me in thanking our guests?